Greetings. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at typical burials in first century Palestine. And we're especially going to focus in on an interesting phenomena known as the use of ossuaries in these burials. A good beginning place is to ask, well, what is an ossuary? This might be a new word to you. And in fact, it's a great word, a great Scrabble word. You know, if you don't get anything else out of this class, you're going to get some great Scrabble words. Take a look at this, ossuary. When you're stuck with a number of vowels and a Y, what a great Scrabble word. But what is this thing that we call an ossuary? Well, very simply, it's a small box or chest, and it contains bones that have been gathered from what we would call a primary burial. That is, in typical first century burials, the body was brought into a tomb and laid on a shelf for about a year. And then the family members would go back into the tomb, collect the bones, and place those bones into this ossuary box. And so you could get a number of bones from different people placed in the same box. That is, you might have an ossuary that contains bones from 3 or 4 or 6 people. The word ossuary actually derives from a Latin word, ossuagium. And ossuagium was used as a verb to describe the act of gathering the bones for this secondary burial. And this was just a very common practice in the late Second Temple period, Second Temple Judaism, among Jews in Palestine and also among the early Jewish Christians. This process of ossuagium was not unique to Jews and Christians. In fact, the practice is spread over a wide geographical area over a long chronological period of time. So, for instance, we have evidence of the use of ossuaries in northern Africa, the city-state of Carthage. It was practiced up in Anatolia. You should be aware that Anatolia is an ancient designation for what is today modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor, and evidence of ossuagium in the island of Crete in the early Bronze Age. It was practiced in Egypt, city of Alexandria in the 2nd, 3rd century AD. It was practiced in Corinth in Greece. It was practiced off to the east in Mesopotamia, an area known as Parthia. It was practiced even further east of the Tigris River in the area of Persia. It was practiced up to the north of Palestine in the coastal area known as Phoenicia, and was found, ossuaries have been found at the city of Ugarit, which was a major city, Canaanite city, back in the 15th century BC. And of course, this was practiced widely in the land of Israel. Just to give you a sense of how many ossuaries have been found, back in 1994, Levi Ramani published a very impressive work, which was a catalog of all the Jewish ossuaries that had been found up till that point. And in his work, he lists 895 inscribed or decorated ossuaries. And of course, that was a number of years ago. By now, the count of ossuaries that have been found number well over 1,200. Well, since our focus is what's going on with burials in Palestine about the 1st century, we can take a look at the chronology of ossuary use and manufacture in Palestine. And there appear to be 3 main stages or periods of ossuary use. The first period would be from about 20, maybe 15 BCE to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The second period would be from after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 up to about 135 CE. And then finally, the third period is in the late 2nd to about the middle of the 3rd century AD. The archaeological evidence of other materials found in association with the ossuaries make it very clear that the ossuaries were introduced in large measure into Palestine during the Herodian period. One of the reasons we can say this is in the context of some of these tombs, some of these burials where ossuaries are found, a number of Herodian period lamps have been found. And so it's pretty clear that ossuaries in Palestine are introduced in a large measure in and around Jerusalem about 20 or maybe to about 15 BCE. And of course, that's during the reign of Herod the Great. The ossuaries we have are constructed out of a few types of materials. However, overwhelmingly, most of the ossuaries we have were constructed out of a very soft limestone that is extremely prevalent in and around the areas of Jerusalem. And this is by far and away the most common material used to construct an ossuary. In fact, about 95% of all ossuaries we have are out of this soft type of limestone. There's also, geologically, in the area of Palestine, a harder limestone. And some of the ossuaries have been made out of this harder limestone, but only about 24 of those exist right now. Clay was used, but these were ossuaries that dated a little bit later. None of the ossuaries that date before 70 CE are made out of clay, only those from a later period. And a few ossuaries were made out of wood. However, this is really quite rare. The form of construction of the ossuaries was pretty uniform throughout time and over space. They're really quite simple rectangular boxes or chests. And there are some very early Egyptian prototypes that people think the later ossuaries were modeled upon. And you can see in the diagram here that there's some variation in that some of the ossuaries had a totally flat bottom, while others had feet. And so these are the two main variations in the way in which an ossuary would be made. Now, the size of the ossuaries could vary a bit from person to person. Of course, the box needed to be large enough in order to hold the largest human bone, which is the leg bone, the femur. And you can see that the length of the ossuaries varied from about 16.5 inches to about 25.5 inches long. The ossuaries were about 9 to 11 inches wide, and they were only about 11 or nearly a foot to about 15.5 inches high. Some are a little larger. These ossuaries oftentimes would hold the bones of more than one individual. In the next video, we're going to be taking a look at a couple specific cases of some famous ossuaries that have been found, and we'll see that one of them held bones from a number of different people. The width of the walls was really a little thinner than you might expect. It was only about a little over an inch in width that they would make the walls of the ossuaries. So these aren't large boxes. Now, what is really interesting about these ossuaries is the fact that a number of them have inscriptions. About a quarter of the ossuaries that have been found contain some sort of writing on them. And in fact, most of these inscriptions were incised into the limestone with a sharp tool, perhaps a nail. Sometimes nails are discarded and found right at the site of where the ossuary is discovered in a tomb. A few of the ossuaries are decorated and written upon with charcoal or ink or some sort of paint. And these inscriptions are very interesting because, well, they're not done very well. They're carelessly executed. That is, the carving into the limestone, the form of the letters. It looks like a second grader did it. Letters are clumsily spaced. There are spelling errors. The letters are shaped poorly. And so that's an interesting aspect of these ossuaries. And we'll take a look now at some examples of some of these inscriptions. In Romani's catalog of ossuaries, we find the following distribution of the types of scripts that are employed in the ossuaries. 143 ossuaries have inscriptions formed with Jewish letters, Jewish script. 73 ossuaries are written with Greek script. There are 14 ossuaries that have been found that in fact have both Greek and Jewish scripts on the ossuary. A couple of ossuaries have been found written in Latin, and one is inscribed in a script known from the city-state of Palmyra. And the languages that are typically employed on these ossuaries would be the three common languages in first century Palestine: Aramaic, Greek, and Hebrew. You know, the linguistic situation in Palestine in the first century is very complex, and it's a mistake to think that all Jews in Palestine in the first century are speaking Aramaic or just Hebrew. In fact, many Jews in Palestine in the first century speak Greek, or Greek and Aramaic, or Greek and Aramaic and Hebrew. So it's a very complicated situation with regards to what languages are being used in first century Palestine. What one finds primarily inscribed on the ossuaries are names. And so far, 147 different names have been found on the ossuaries. 80 of these are Jewish names. 58, however, are Greek names, which shows very clearly that in first century Palestine, many Jews were named with Greek names. It demonstrates clearly how important Hellenistic Greek culture was in first century Palestine, even among Jews. 7 names are Latin, and 2 names are Palmyrene, and that's that city-state up to the north of Palestine. And here we have an example of a Jewish name on an ossuary, the name Judas. And take a look the way it's written out. It's a Jewish name, but it is written out with Greek characters. And so you have iota, omicron, upsilon, delta, alpha, and sigma. Eudas, a Greek spelling of a Jewish name. Let's take a look at some examples of names that have been found. And here we have some of the most common Hebrew masculine names. We have Simon, Shimon, 26 times. Joseph, Yosef, 19 times. Judas, Judah, 18 times. Lazarus, 16 times. John, 12 times. Ananias, Jesus, 10 times. Matthew, 8 times. And so you can see these are names that turn up in the New Testament, and these are common given Hebrew names in first century Palestine. Take a look at the example we have here of Simon written out. Actually, the full text reads Hananiah, son of Simon, ben Shimon. And so the top line has the Hebrew name Hananiah, and the second line has 2 words. Starting on the right, the first letter is Beit, Nun, for Bain, son of, and then the last 5 letters compose the name Shimon, Simon. Well, here are some examples of some of the most common feminine names that we find on the ossuaries. Salome, Maria, Marta, and here we have an example of Marta being written out as it was inscribed on the ossuary. And Marta is actually an Aramaic name, and we know that because of the way the name is spelled. Let's take a look at this name. It's comprised of 4 letters. Starting on the right, you have Mem, Resh, Tav, Aleph, Marta. Now let's start to take a look at the artistry of the construction of some of these ossuaries. And to begin with, the ossuaries typically had a lid, and the ossuaries, about 40% of them, contain special marks, what are known today as carpenter's marks. And basically they're little marks or grooves or X's that enable one to properly line up the lid, the cover of the ossuary, so that it's going the right direction once it has been fashioned to correctly fit. Well, let's start out by taking a look at some of the ornamental motifs that we find on the ossuaries. And you'll see that there's great artistry, beautiful craftsmanship involved in the decoration of these ossuaries. The principal ornamental motif or artistic design that we find on the ossuaries is that of the rosette, which is a very beautiful, ornate petal structure radiating out in a circle. And these are drawn with the aid of a compass. They are extremely common, not only in ossuaries, but we find them on the face or facade of tombs. And the six-petaled rosette is the most common one, although we'll see in the next slide there is a rich variety of the forms of the rosettes that they constructed to put on these ossuaries. Well, here we have some examples of the rich variety of rosettes that were composed on the ossuaries. So for example, on the left in the center, we see a four-petaled rosette, which was created by taking a circle and bisecting it at right angles. In the center column, the top, we have a very intricate 12-petaled rosette, and that was created by superimposing two six-petaled rosettes. By using different radii on the compass, they could create a rich variety of more and more complex and beautiful rosette-themed patterns. And so this is just a very distinctive feature of typical ossuaries in the first century. Another common decorative motif is that of amphorae. Now, these amphorae, they're actually ancient vessels or pitchers or urns. They're very common in the Mediterranean, ancient Mediterranean world. They're used to transport grain or liquids. While they may look like cremation urns, they most likely are not. In the case of the Jewish ossuary, cremation had not been a part of Jewish culture, and so these are thought to be merely ornamental in nature. Palm trees are another frequent motif. Now, the question of some of these motifs is, are they being used symbolically, or are they just decorative representations? It's a very famous series of books written by a fellow with the interesting name of Goodenough, Edwin Goodenough, and he wrote a multi-volume work on symbols in ancient Judaism. And Goodenough thought that the ornamental motifs that we find on the ossuaries just really needed to be interpreted symbolically. And so some people have suggested that the palm tree, for instance, is a symbol of the tree of life. Of course, the difficulty with that is then trying to apply what the motif represents in all cases. And in the example of the amphorae we just saw, it's an open question what symbolically that would represent. So while it makes a certain amount of sense to think about the motifs symbolically, the fact of the matter is it's difficult to answer all the questions of what these various decorative motifs represent if they're to be thought of as a symbol. The white lily, which oftentimes grew in the areas where we find tombs in the outskirts of Jerusalem, is also pictured on the ossuaries. And you can see there's a variety of the ways in which this flower was portrayed on the ossuaries, but this is another of the very common themes that one finds. Architectural columns are also found. And here, both types of Greek style, commonly used in Herodian period architecture in Palestine, the Ionic style and the Corinthian style of column. are both pictured on the ancient ossuary. We also find decorative strips of geometrical shapes, and these are known as cornices. You find a wide variety of how these are created on the different ossuaries. You can see that they're very fine and ornate. They're often used as a border pattern around the edge of the box. In the corners, one often finds an angle ornament. They might use either the geometrical cornice, or sometimes they pictured an ivy leaf. And the ivy leaf is very interesting because it seems like perhaps that is related to another very important architectural feature in Herodian period building, and that is the heart-shaped column. One finds columns, if you look down from the top, it looks basically like the shape of a heart. However, it's not really the portrayal of a human heart. That is much later in history where one begins to see that. But some think that the heart-shaped column in Herodian period is actually an ivy-leafed shaped column. And these are important because during the period of time in which Herod the Great and his successors are doing much building in and around Jerusalem throughout Palestine, heart-shaped columns were found on either palaces or synagogues. So they're always associated with very important buildings. Here are a few examples of decoration. So on the top we have a lily in the center flanked by two rosettes. You can see the cornice around the edges. Underneath in the center we see an amphora with several very ornate rosettes to the side, and again the geometrical cornice around the edges. Here we have a couple of more examples. On the top we have columns in the center flanked by rosettes. On the bottom we have geometric cornices going around the edge, down the center, and then several very ornate rosettes. Well, after seeing some examples of the beautiful craftsmanship, the ornate decoration, the precise creation of geometrical forms and rosettes, one comes back to the inscriptions and sees this very crude writing in most instances. These poorly shaped letters, misspelled words, horrible spacing between words. And it seems pretty clear that the artist who is creating the ossuary is not doing the inscription. The basic thought is that after the body was in the tomb for a year, the bones were free of all flesh and decay. Family members would come and enter the tomb, collect the bones, and put them into the ossuary. And it's thought that at that time, a member or several members of the family would inscribe the ossuary. And as I said, sometimes actual nails that were used for the inscribing into the limestone were found in tombs. And this makes pretty good sense in explaining the paradox of these beautifully crafted ossuaries, the way they're constructed, teamed with the pretty crude and elemental writing that one finds on the ossuary. Well, let's finish up part one by looking at this example of what could only be called a very crudely carved ossuary. Take a look at this one compared to some of the beautifully carved and ornate ossuaries we looked at previously. This one is your basic, less expensive model. And it makes sense that there was a range of cost for ossuaries, and the cost would vary, of course, by how much time and energy the artisan invested in making the product. Not only is the writing pretty crude, but you can see that in a very basic model here, the actual carving of the ossuary itself could be very basic.